Sounds live to me. Welcome. I'd like to add my welcome to Ian's and Judith and Peter.
Could you speak up louder?
Can you hear that now?
Better.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to add my welcome to Ian's and Judith's and Peter's. Thank you all for coming. I'm just going to moderate this discussion, but let me set the ground rules, if you will. We have three very talented and able spokespeople for the native perspective on the Treaty of Cession and on the Alaska Purchase, and also three able and talented Russian scholars on that same subject. The way we will proceed is that first the Russians will go, and we'll take about 25 or 30 minutes, and each will in turn make their principal points for 2 or 3 minutes each, and then we will discuss among ourselves some of the insights that they provide us. And then the second 30 minutes we will do exactly the same with our folks with the native perspective. Again, 2 or 3 minutes of your principal point, and then we will have additional questions and discussion among us. And then the final 25 or 30 minutes.
Stephen, you need to speak louder.
I'm so sorry, thank you. And for the final 25 or 30 minutes, all 6 of our panelists will discuss various aspects of the points that they have made and others that they may wish to. So without further ado, let me make the introductions. We have Daley Durow, who is a professor in the political science department at the University of Alaska, but she is also vice chair of the United Nations Committee on Indigenous Rights and Human Rights, in addition to any number of other posts that she holds representing indigenous rights in an international context, not just with the United Nations. Joaqlin Estus is Tlingit, just retired from a long and distinguished career in public media, with first working in Juneau and then here in Anchorage, KSKA and KNBA, Alaska Public Media. You will recognize her from her very frequent appearances on Alaska News Nightly. And Mary Sattler-Paltola, known to many of you, was in the legislature for 5 terms. She is currently with the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission, but she has held many posts, including on the city council in Bethel, and ably represented the Bethel-Kuskokwim region for some time. Thank you all for being with us tonight. And our Russianists include Professor Andrei Grinev from the St. Petersburg Pedagogical University. He has published numerous articles in the Journal of the Alaska Historical Society, Alaska History, and an important book, The Russian America and the Tlingit Indians, 1741 to 1867. Professor Ilya Vinkovetsky from Simon Fraser University also has published a number of seminal articles and a very important book on Russian America, an overseas colony of a continental empire, 1804 to 1867, emphasizing that part of the Russian-American experience for Russia. And finally, my good friend, Professor Andrei Znamenski, familiar to many of you, teaching at the University of Memphis and has written on shamanism in Siberia and in Alaska, and now also in Central Asia, as well as numerous and important articles on the history of Russian America. So then, let me turn it please to Professor Andrei Grinev, and you see projected behind us Professor Grinev's points, and I believe that Professor Znamenski is going to translate for Professor Grinev. Thank you, gentlemen.
Продаже Аляски посвящено примерно, даже больше, 20 монографий и статей. В свое время я пытался, так сказать, посчитать вот, перечисленные в историографии причины продажи, и вот насчитал 16 примерно вот таких причин, вот они представлены.
About the history of Russian America, we have more than 20 monographs. I'm speaking on behalf of Andrei Grinev. I decided to summarize the major reasons why Alaska was ceded or sold to the United States. These are not my points. This is the summary of what I concluded based on my readings of Russian historiography. And I want to say there are 16 major reasons why Russia sold Alaska to the United States. And here they are.
С моей точки зрения, наиболее важной причиной была сложившаяся в России система, социально-экономическая система, основанная на всевластии государства, которая контролировала не только основные ресурсы страны, но и людей.
I have my own opinion about why Russian Empire sold Alaska to the United States. And this opinion is the following. The major reason why Russia ceded Alaska is the system, socio-economic system of the Russian Empire, particularly omnipotent power of the state, backward authoritarian state that could not colonize this area, that didn't want to colonize this area, that controlled the population movement, and that was the major reason.
А без вот такого постоянного русского населения невозможно было ни осваивать эффективно ресурсы Аляски, ни подчинить воинственные племена, которые населяли эту землю, ни противодействовать зарубежным золотоискателям, контрабандистам, торговцам.
Strange as it may sound, the Russian Empire herself prevented people moving to their Alaska. Russian Empire did not want people to colonize Alaska. They wanted to exploit resources of Alaska. Russian Empire didn't want to bring families, didn't want to bring people to Alaska, and there was no human resources to prevent the movement of gold miners, foreign gold miners, people of the other nations and nationalities. And again, we have to think about it.
В конечном итоге, неэффективная система, которая сложилась в российском государстве, она стала причиной уступки Аляски Соединенным Штатам, потому что эта система не выдерживала конкуренции с капиталистическими странами, где была свобода перемещения людей. И как раз Аляска, кстати, вот Русская Америка, как тогда называли, она граничила с одной стороны с Канадой, с Британской Колумбией, где уже, так сказать, сложилась иная система. И в Русскую Америку проникали также представители Соединенных Штатов. И вот неэффективная система, которая сложилась в России, она оказалась не жизнеспособной, не конкурентоспособной по сравнению с тем, что было в Великобритании и США.
The whole system of economic government, political government of authoritarian Russia could not compete with capitalist United States and capitalist Britain. It simply could not compete with these countries. Economically, politically, socially, it was to lose Alaska.
That's all.
That was that's his own opinion again. But if you want to know about the Russian historiography, about opinions of Russian historians, what they think about the major reasons why Alaska was sold, here they are, and we can zoom these points and we can flash them, or you can come afterwards and take a picture of them.
Thank you very much, Professor Grinev. One point that I would like to have us all focus on as Ilya begins his remarks, following up on Professor Grinev, the largest number of people from the Russian Empire ever in Alaska at one time did not exceed 600. So this is very important for understanding how the Russians thought about this enterprise of theirs in the Americas. Ilya, you have insight into this, I think.
Thank you. And it's an honor to be here. Am I speaking in here? It's an honor to be here, and I'll be happy to talk about what I think is. Well, I think it's important to talk about not just the reasons, but really the bubble, if you will, in which the decision makers. There were basically 5 men sitting in December 1866 in St. Petersburg with the Tsar, who were making the decision to actually part with Alaska at the time, during the time that Russia was undergoing the great reforms, which a substantial number of reforms. And one thing I wanted to emphasize about this is that this is a time, I think ironically, of when both Alaska was, of course, important to the people who lived here and to the people who were concerned with Alaska. But to both St. Petersburg and Washington, the buyer and the seller in this deal between aggressive empire states that was being dealt with, they had other concerns. And primarily, one of those concerns was the market in Asia, to which both of them wanted to reach out. So Seward, there was no accident, as you mentioned the other day, that Alaska had just acquired Midway Island next to Hawaii. I'm sorry, not Alaska, United States. And Seward wanted to acquire British Columbia as well as Alaska, and as a way to get to China and Japan and the Japanese market. And the Russians similarly had recently acquired territory in Central Asia, but more importantly, I think, from this game that they were playing, territory in the Russian Far East. They acquired a beautiful future port of Vladivostok and other ports of Nakhodka. And for the first time, the Russian Navy, which was running Alaska, had a decent port or potential port in the Far East, in the Pacific, outside of Sitka and outside of Kodiak. And so that took so if you're sitting in a committee on the Naval Committee in 1866 in Russia, and you're thinking, well, we can have a port with a beautiful harbor in Vladivostok, or should we just develop this far-off territory in New Archangel or Sitka, which they knew because of a secret treaty during the Crimean War between Britain and Russia, that was vulnerable because of a secret treaty that excluded this territory from the Crimean War. So the Navy knew that basically 1 or 2 British ships, if they come to Sitka Harbor, would basically take over all of Alaska from Russia. They would lose it. So they felt very vulnerable. And that vulnerability played a very large part. But also it's because there was the relations at that time, people often forget, between the United States and Russia were very warm. Russia was on the side of the North in the Civil War that had just ended in the United States, and both those countries, and Russia had suffered from Britain in the Crimean War 10 years earlier, and both of those countries were very much in rivalry with Britain. So part of the idea of selling Alaska to the United States by Russia was to stick it to the British, which they indeed did, which they did, and so it's no accident that Canada, where I'm from, is also 150 years, because it really focused the minds of the British Columbians and other people in Canada when they saw that Alaska was becoming American, to form their own confederation or be absorbed by America.
Please talk into the mic closer.
Thank you, Ilya. So, an alternative port in Asia for the Russian-American Company and the Russian Navy, which perhaps obviated the necessity, or at least desirability, of having Alaska. Professor Znamenski, if you will.
My comment will be a follow-up to Ilya's comments. Ilya just mentioned that Canada celebrates or commemorates 150th anniversary. But don't forget there is another date, 150 years of incorporation of Central Asia within the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. And what I'm trying to bring up to our attention, that will be my own, might be biased view, that's my personal view, why Alaska was ceded by the Russian Empire to the United States. The point is that, my point, the major role belongs to a change in geopolitical priorities of Russia. Alaska was sold during the year 1867, I would like you to remember this date, when Central Asia, so-called Turkestan, was included into the Russian Empire. So one piece of land was ceded, and another huge, I repeat, huge chunk of land was acquired by the Russian Empire. And this chunk of land was acquired in the process of competition with the British Empire, because British Empire was expanding from the south northward, India and Afghanistan. This huge area, Turkestan, officially became known as Turkestan General Governorship, was needed by the Russian Empire as a source of cotton. Simultaneously, Russia was expanding to the Far East, and that was another area of major Russian priorities on the eastern borderland. Why the Far East? Central Asia was to provide cotton to the Russian Empire, industrial growth. The Far East was to become the breadbasket of the Russian Empire. And ironically, the person who came up with the idea to sell Alaska was Prince Muraviev-Amursky, who actually argued that Russia should purposely ignore Alaska, cede Alaska either to Britain or, as it turned out, to the United States for geopolitical reasons, and purposely should choose the Far East as the area to be colonized by the Russian peasants, Kazakhs, to turn this area in the breadbasket. Here you can see the map of Alaska, and we did the same talk in Sitka, and I regret in high school, and I regret that we didn't have this map at that time, but now I insisted to put this map, look carefully at this map. It was printed in St. Petersburg, 1826, and the most striking thing that strikes us about this map is that we have coastal areas populated, named, and the blank spot in the middle. And certain nationalities are mistakenly put on this map that never lived in Alaska, like Chukchi, for example. See? Again, by sampling this map, I want to send you a message that how little the Russian Empire knew about Alaska, how little she explored Alaska. And another last point, by 1867, that's exactly how it still looked. Although I repeat, this particular map was printed in 1826, but by 1867, that's still how exactly it looked. Okay, so the empire did not control Alaska. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrei. Well, maybe we get a somewhat diminished picture of Russian America from these three presentations. I think Americans coming out of their history education in the schools have a tendency to have a particular view of colonization of people moving either to the eastern part of North America or later to the western part of North America, and establishing towns and farms and the population growing and the sovereignty of the mother country, if you will, extending over that. That's not the picture that you present to us at all. You present to us a picture of a very limited notion, with the Russian government inhibiting population flowing from Asia to America, and essentially the Navy running things for a small population, many of whom were not permanent at all, but instead were temporary. So let me begin by asking, what is your opinion? Was this a success for Russia, this experiment from 1741 to 1867? Ilya.
Well, actually, I have to turn around and say, can you hear me well? No? Yes? Okay. Actually, I have to say that actually, in many ways, from the point of view of the Empire State, right? That's how we have to define it. From the point of view of the people running it, I think some of it was a success. They did successfully, however we define it, whether we like it or not, they did successfully exploit the sea otter population by organizing Alutiiq and Unangan men into these parties that hunted sea otters all up and down the Pacific coast of all the way down sometimes to California and farther. And it did do some things, and it didn't do other things. I think the Russian-American company, which was run in part by the Navy, but in part was a private company, was in some ways, I call it a subcontractor of empire, that was very successful in pursuing its mission of keeping this territory while it was Russian, kind of like Hudson's Bay Company did for the British in Canada. So I think in some ways they were successful. Now, there are more bigger ambitions of some of the dreamers in the company of conquering going to conquer other territories, were always kind of an outlier, and they were fantastic from the early 19th century. But really, the idea of managing this territory, and also the fact you have to remember that the Russian-American company, which ran this territory, also used the sea otter furs and fur seal furs to trade with China for tea, and they did that very successfully as well. So I think in some ways, or at least successfully, I wouldn't say very successfully. So I think in some ways they were successful in what they did. Yes.
Okay. I don't want to argue with Ilya because he made a good point. He actually says that from the viewpoint of Russian America, they did accomplish what they wanted, because the major goal was first procuring the fur resources. But again, we have to, we're talking about apples and oranges in this case. Yes, the major point was to procure pelts at first sea otters, and then when the population of sea otters diminished, so they tried to move inland unsuccessfully, I think, in my viewpoint. And at the very end, by the way, Russian-American company had to reorient its activities to the tea trade to make money somehow. But the point I tried to make, I guess my viewpoint was more geopolitical. Did this imperial power successfully control the land mass to claim this territory or not? And the point I made, I think, successfully, that the empire could not claim this area. It was a middle ground, like I'm using expression, my favorite expression, Richard White, American historian. So it was more as a middle ground land. The land, especially central parts of Alaska, were not claimed by anybody. They belonged to local indigenous tribes. And I always use this example that in response to desire of Central Athabascan tribes, the Hudson Bay Company opened, set up Fort Yukon right in the middle of so-called Russian America, within the borders of the Russian America. That shows that the empire did not control this land mass. Although Ilya, he is right by arguing that the major goal was the fur resources. Okay, and that is why they were not interested in bringing more colonizers here. Okay.
Your map is very instructive, that great empty white space that the Russians did not penetrate and did not settle. How is it then, and perhaps Professor Grinev would address this, how is it then that in 1825 the other powers, Great Britain, the United States, recognized a boundary far to the east of any territory that the Russians held on to and gave us the boundaries of Alaska that we know and love today? How did that happen?
Ну, очевидно, что и со стороны Великобритании, которая руками компании Гудзонова залива продвигалась все дальше на запад, территории, вот, где прошла граница, они не контролировались ни с этой, ни с той стороны. Дележ происходил на перспективу. Ни британских, ни русских поселений, и поселенцев там не было в то время. Это все было сделано в Петербурге, в Лондоне решались эти вопросы. Вот, когда там просто не было еще ни русского, ни британского, ни американского населения.
Andrei says that neither Canada nor Russian-American company had permanent settlements on the either side of their officially defined border. The decisions were made in Europe, and these were artificial decisions to draw this border. So, in reality, on the ground, the border did not reflect the situation on the ground.
Well, we would like, I think, to come back to the three of you gentlemen, but I think that we will turn now to our native perspective presenters. In some ways, this is the native sesquicentennial, in the sense that I have seen much, much more attention to the question of what was the status of Alaska Native people in 1867 and what was their hold on the land and why was that question ignored than I have seen in the past. And I think that may be a very important change of perspective. Mary, I wonder if we might begin with you tonight and have you make your principal points.
You caught me off guard. I thought Daley would go first. But you're the moderator, so you're the boss. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Louder, let Mary.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Mary Peltola, and I'm from Bethel, which is 400 miles west of Anchorage. And it's a real pleasure to be with you. Before we began, I was able to chat a little bit with Joaqlin, and I think, you know, the things that we chatted about were revealing to me even in 2017. She was telling me how the event went in Sitka, and she told me that in Sitka they have ceremonies commemorating this transfer, this transaction. And coming from Bethel, I have no exposure to that. We really do have 6 states within our state. Even today, we're very removed. And I could go on and on about that, but I won't. So suffice it to say, though, that 150 years ago, I'm sure that my mother's grandparents had no idea that there was this presumption of ownership by visitors who visited us and traded with us and brought us religion and other good things, useful things. But I don't think that they considered those rightful owners with the ability to then sell what they didn't own. And I also think that it's noteworthy that this talk is coinciding with the AFN convention, the Alaska Federation of Natives. Every year the corporations come together. It started out really as a corporate convention, and it's become more tribal since our 229 tribes have been federally recognized. Again, so I think when the ANCSIS, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, happened, I think that was a testament to the Russians did not have title. And so I think that this talk and the sesquicentennial coinciding with this convention is very appropriate. So with that, I'll end.
Great. Well, we will come back to some of those points, I hope. Daly, may we go to you? You have been very, very active in the representation of indigenous rights, and this is an issue of indigenous right.
Cliana, thank you very much for the opportunity to Peter and the Cook Inlet Historical Society. We've been trying to make this happen, at least my participation happen, a couple of times. So I am really, really pleased to be here this evening, and also to see such a good turnout for an event on a cold early winter night here. My main message, and it actually very neatly coincides with the comments that our Russian scholars and friends have shared with us as far as Russia really not penetrating the territory of Alaska. And I would tend to look at these issues from a legal perspective and the provisions of the Treaty of Cession, and also in the context of international relations, which I teach at the university. As Mary has stated, her forebears not thinking about the Treaty of Cession, not being apprised of the provisions, and it maybe to a great degree not even impacting them to this day is significant in and of itself. In my view, one of the important things about this dialogue is the fact that though it was a bilateral treaty between the United States and Russia, the valid claims of Aboriginal title to the land, I mean, over the vast tracts of land, all the area, including the area that the Russians did settle only temporarily, remained with Alaska Native people, with the Aboriginal people. And that throughout contact and the entire Russian-American era here in our homelands never interrupted that valid Aboriginal title to the land. And in fact, if anything, the Treaty of Cession only created a bit of confusion as to civilized tribes, uncivilized tribes, unencumbered title to land, provision 6 of the treaty, Article 3 of the treaty, which does make reference to uncivilized tribes, and the fact that it triggered, in the context of federal Indian law, some important discussions about whether or not that Aboriginal title was ever interrupted or encroached upon throughout the various different federal Indian law doctrines that subsequently applied to the so-called uncivilized tribes in Alaska. And so my main message is that really the provisions of the treaty itself and all the subsequent actions that have taken place since 1867 have never interrupted or interfered with or encroached upon Aboriginal title to land. Really, it wasn't until 1971 and the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 were the rights of Alaska Native people in terms of Aboriginal right and title to land really clarified in any way, shape, or form. And so I think it's significant in terms of international relations, taking a bilateral treaty and the uninterrupted right and title of Alaska Native people to this moment in time, and the emergence or the progressive development of law that now affirms very explicitly the rights of Alaska Native people as indigenous peoples in the international legal arena.
Indeed. quite remarkable. The parties to that bilateral treaty simply didn't take that Aboriginal title into consideration. And it was quite explosive when in 1941, in the Hualapai case, the United States Supreme Court found for the validity of Aboriginal title. One thing that I think many Alaskans do not understand is that there were never any treaties with Alaska Native people, and consequently no extinguishment of that title as there had been in the lower 48. So in 1971, when Congress sat down to look at this issue, potentially almost all of Alaska could have been subject to Aboriginal title. Joaqlin, you were in Sitka, and there was there a very palpable sense of the need for recognition. What is your perspective on this sesquicentennial?
Well, you know, in Sitka, the Kiksadi clan, which is one of the larger clans in Sitka, held a ceremony at Castle Hill, which is one of the sites where they celebrate Alaska Day. And Mary mentioned that Alaska Day is a really big deal in Sitka. They have a reenactment of the flags going up and down. They have guns going, you know, like a 21-gun salute or something, and they have a parade. When you come into the airport, women are wearing period costumes, and there was a ball the night before last night. So what the Kiksadi did was very eloquently state that they had been left out. And that, so when we talk about a bilateral treaty, you know, basically, at that point, when that treaty was enacted, there was a complete denial of Aboriginal title, and that attitude persists to this day. People don't recognize Aboriginal title, and they belittle the idea that Alaska Natives owned Alaska. And what the treaty did, what the Americans did when they took over, is Alaska Natives were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to file mining, apply for mining permits. They couldn't vote. They didn't have citizenship. Schools were desegregated. And until Natives sued in 1972 in the Molly Hooch case for the state to provide high schools equal education to Alaska Natives, Natives couldn't go beyond the 6th grade unless they went to a boarding school. And those of you who are parents can imagine what that would be like. Sending your 11 or 12-year-old child to a boarding school to be raised by strangers. And unless you could afford it, many times those children stayed there. They didn't come home. I mean, imagine a small village with no teenagers most of the year. And so what I mentioned, so then when the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was enacted, Alaska has 375 million acres, and what ANCSA did was it transferred title to 44 million acres to Native corporations, not to tribes and not to individuals. They also awarded $1 billion to corporations. Now, $1 billion, I mean, that's a lot of money. I would love to, you know, have that in my coffer somewhere. But when you think of the wealth of Alaska, I mean, one of the slides that we just saw, it just flashed, but it showed people standing next to stacks and stacks of gold bars. And if you think of the mineral wealth, including oil, and all of the other resources, imagine if native ownership of those resources had not been ignored and denied and belittled. Can I say one more thing? Okay, so the other thing that goes along with this, and I gave a talk about this in Sitka, is that there are a lot of racist stereotypes about Alaska Natives. And, you know, it's very hard to take that personally, to have people assume, I mean, the example I gave in Sitka was people, you know, I met somebody, they said, "You're Alaska Native? You're so well dressed." And, you know, when I gave the talk in Sitka, I gave numerous examples of this, things that have happened to me, and that every time it happened, it was a slap in the face. And I think that that stems in part from this whole concept that we didn't have rights, we didn't own the land, and, you know, we were considered savages, which helped the Americans rationalize their taking of the land and resources.
Mary, let me ask you if you would want to elaborate some on the 6 states of Alaska and perhaps different Native perceptions in different parts of the state. A point that I've heard Joaqlin make in this context is that the severing of individuals from the land, which is confirmed in ANCSA, because as she points out, the title grant was to corporations and not to individuals or even to tribes. So is that felt in the same way in the 6 states of Alaska, and what are the implications of that?
I think that the impacts are felt differently in each of the regions of the state. And the way I see Alaska is the Arctic slope as one region, and you know, the Inubaks, and then the Athabascans, Western Alaskans, the Aleutian chain, South Central, and Southeast. And many of us across the state don't know about our other regions. I think in the minority in Alaska, where I have had the luxury and been fortunate to be able to visit different parts of the state. And it's always eye-opening to me when I go to different parts of the state. I'm always learning something new and different about our different histories. And, you know, before contact, we had 20 different languages, or 20 different linguistic bases, and of course many more dialects of those 20 different distinct languages. Coming from my region, the village that my mother is from, Kwethluk, has a very heavy Russian influence. We have the St. Herman's Russian Orthodox Church, and many of our young men have gone to the seminary in Kodiak and become priests. When I was growing up, most of my age mates still had names like Theodosius and Alphanetia and Agrafena. I mean, my contemporaries have these very Russian names, Xenia. There are so many Xenias in Kwethluk that they're nicknamed Minnie and Sally, you know, just random names that don't have anything to do with Xenia because there are so many. And then, of course, you know, I mean, now we have very different contemporary names, Destiny and, you know, lots of great contemporary names. But, you know, my interaction, I mean, I have this kind of fondness towards my imagination, you know, how I imagine the interaction with Russians. We have a lot of loaner words for butter and salt and cloth, and, you know, I think there are hundreds of loaner words that are Russian words. And so I think that is very different. I gave a talk on salmon at a conference many years ago in Portland, and there were also people from Russia who gave a talk on, they were also at this conference, and my portion talked about the heavy dependence on salmon that we have in our region. We customarily harvest 85,000 Chinook a summer just on our river alone, just on the Kuskokwim. And then when I was talking with the Russian academics, they were saying, well, you should be thankful that you were transferred to America because our natives don't subsist in the same way. There, it's considered poaching, and you know, those resources belong to the state. And that was, you know, very informative to me because I have, you know, not knowing anything about how it was then or modern Russia, I just, I don't know, I had a very different experience. But, and I can't necessarily speak for the other regions of the state. It would be interesting to have a panel of people from the 6 parts of Alaska to give their own perspective. I'm sure that it is a different perspective in the Kodiak region or the Aleut region. Does that answer it?
Oh, indeed, indeed. Significant perspective, it seems to me. Daley, you, in a sense, have been working in a more general context of indigenous rights and pulling all of these various perspectives under that banner. What would redress look like?
Well, I think that, again, my main point in looking at this history is that Aboriginal title up until the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was intact. It was whole, it was intact. And the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act dealt with land. It didn't deal with the political right of self-government or the political right of self-determination, nor did it provide any comprehensive approach to harvesting rights, hunting, fishing, and harvesting rights. And those familiar with the Act, it purportedly extinguished Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights. But we know, especially after Mary's statement, that they harvest 85,000 Chinook alone on the Kuskokwim River, that hunting and fishing and harvesting continues to this day. And Congress and the United States government, and in fact, just by virtue of Article 3 of the Treaty of Cession, began to adopt policies and laws concerning Alaska Native people, or the so-called uncivilized tribes in Alaska. And but what's important about Article 3, and that last sentence of Article 3, is that it wholesale applies federal Indian law and doctrines and statutory law to Alaska Native people. And I think this is really important, especially when you think about redress and reparations and recourse for the purported extinguishment of Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights, and also in areas that remain unresolved. And in this regard, I am specifically referring to the marine environment and in particular along the north coast of Alaska, the northwest coast of Alaska, and the Inupiat people and their rights and interests in the marine environment and the coastal areas. ANCSA didn't address those issues, and I would say that in terms of redress, there are a number of outstanding or unresolved issues that do need to be addressed. But they didn't get spawned out of the Treaty of Cession, but moreover left out of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, left out of the ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands and Conservation Act, that remain unresolved and have put us in the circumstance of the perennial issue of our harvesting rights, and also our interests as, especially on the part of coastal indigenous peoples in Alaska, to the marine environment. And I think that there's ample room in the way of invoking international indigenous human rights to bring us far beyond the limits that have emerged since the Treaty of Cession.
Yeah, good. And we haven't even begun to talk about the native sovereignty movement and how that may play both positive and negative. Joaqlin?
Yeah, could I want to flesh out the issue of fish and game a little bit, because I mean, at AFN, you can watch AFN on television and you can hear it on the radio. And this morning, a village public safety officer, Jody Potts, gave a talk, and she described her feelings as she went out hunting alone for the first time. And you know, I used to interview a lot of people from rural Alaska And basically, when people are talking about subsistence, they're talking about personhood. If you look at the social structure in a village, I mean, think about what gives you pride as a woman or as a man. You're a good provider. You're good to your children. You're good to your relatives. Subsistence makes all that possible. It allows people to feed their children. It gives men an opportunity to exercise the skills that have been passed down to them. And to be a good hunter and to share the food with other people, often based on kinship, but to share the food with other people in your village is what makes you a good person. You know, we look at people who make a lot of money or they have a lot of power, we acquire status in different ways. In a village, if you're a good hunter, you have the respect of your people. And I mean, what makes me think of it too is if you listen to and I forget her name, but the president of Atna Corporation Michelle Anderson in the eastern interior of Alaska, around Copper Center, that region of the state. It's the only part of the state that is accessible by road, both from Fairbanks and Anchorage. And they're just getting slammed. I mean, and she'll come to a meeting with a long list of what it's like to have non-native hunters come on their lands. They're trespassing on corporate lands and taking caribou. People are pooping in the woods. They're trespassing on private property. They're not harvesting the meat. People are afraid. Jody Potts talked about it this morning. She said she was afraid she was going to get shot because there were so many people in the area where she was trying to hunt. So I'm not sure if this is the #1 top issue, but I would say it's right up there with sovereignty, self-determination.
Great, thank you, Joaqlin. I'd like to get some discussion going across this great distance, if you will, from 1867 to 2017, this sesquicentennial. And first let me ask, well, as we speak, think of questions you might want to ask the Russians, and think of questions you might like to ask our native presenters. But I'd like to ask one of you to address the question of, Mary gives us an idealization of the Russian native experience. Andrei Grinev, you've written about this. How ideal was it? What was it like for natives under the Russians?
Это сложный вопрос, потому что колонизация Русской Америки, она имеет несколько периодов. И в разные периоды политика в отношении местного населения была различная очень. На первой стадии, когда происходила колонизация Алеутских островов, частично Кадьяка, политика была очень жесткой, жестокой и на грани геноцида иногда.
Their Russian policies in Alaska were changing in the course of time. During the first period until roughly 1799, 1800, it was a violent confrontation on many occasions.
Политика стала смягчаться постепенно, и начиная с 1818 года, когда к власти в Русской Америке пришли морские офицеры, политика стала эволюционировать все более и более в сторону патернализма.
Beginning of 1818, when Russian Navy officers took over Alaska, started controlling Alaska, the policies softened.
И к концу существования Русской Америки политика была, я бы так сказать, такая очень социальная. российско-американская компания, она заботилась действительно реально о местном населении, но только о том населении, которое принадлежало как бы колониям, зависимое население.
The best way to describe Russian policies during this second soft quote-unquote period was paternalism. There were even some social policies in coastal areas. We can call it taking care of the local population, but it was not really taking care. It was controlling the labor resources that were to provide furs for the Russian-American company. And we're talking not about inland areas, we're not talking about semi-dependent, so-called semi-dependent natives. We're talking only about the thin coastal area where so-called dependent tribes resided.
Это проявлялось в том, что осуществлялась медицинская помощь, вакцинации, давали образование туземцам. В общем, в случае голодовок российско-американская компания оказывала продовольственную помощь, и, так сказать, примеры можно продолжить. Более того, к концу существования Русской Америки вот эти социальные затраты, в том числе и на туземцев, они стали одной из причин финансового кризиса, который поразил рак и привело в конечном итоге одна из причин продажи Русской Америки.
In these coastal areas, in order to conserve labor resources, Russians even provided education to local indigenous people. They did vaccination before epidemics, to prevent epidemics, and they provided certain opportunities to, not opportunities, they provided certain options for local population to So we're talking here about some native population, mostly Creoles, being included in the colonial society as the second tier, second class, when there was the gradation of classes, stratas in the Russian population of Alaska. Russians and people who came from Eurasia, and Creoles, and natives, so three stratas. And again, on my own, I want to emphasize that the gist of Andrei's talk right now is to show that it was the conservation of these labor resources. In fact, he also mentioned that these so-called social expenses became so significant by the end, by 1865, that it became a financial burden for the Russian-American company, which did not get enough profit from the fur trade.
I just wanted to, I wanted to add to this just somewhat different perspective, that it's not just the, these people in St. Petersburg or the people in the company office that are important, but personal relations that people formed. And I think in this way it's both people in the church, but sometimes, but also just individual people who had their own relations that are very difficult sometimes to record in paper, because we don't have all the records for everything. But there were a lot of Russian men who came over and married native women and stayed around and produced children, and there was a lot of relationships that developed between the godparents and godchildren that were genuinely human relations. And so, and sometimes they could be, like in any family, there could be abuse, and there could also be love. And so so it wasn't just about geopolitics and what was good for the company, but this company was composed of people who were real people. And I think the other thing that's, important about the image of the Russians in Alaska is that it was greatly helped because Russians lost Alaska. In other words, because Russians left in 1867, but until 1917, the Russian missions from the Russian church still stayed around. the Russian churchmen could be the good guys because they were no longer defending Russian colonialism, which had its colonial aspects, but instead were combating American colonialism after 1860. So after between 1867 and 1917, and you also have during this time the sort of the indigenization of the church. And again, the Russian image was helped because after 1917, Russians could no longer come here from the Soviet Union, and therefore the church became further indigenized, and the natives were allowed to take over those elements. And so those people that used to be, so I think in many ways the fact that the Russians were left Alaska helps their image today.
Well, and not only does that legacy live in place names and family names, but it lives in the Orthodox communities, particularly in the Aleut villages. Daley, did you have a comment?
Well, Mary, you had a follow-up to this because I was going to give a commentary because on the Russian side, if I understood correctly, in terms of the Alaska Native people, the indigenous peoples, that the Russians had the category of those that were independent, those that were semi-dependent, and those that were dependent. And I think that the comment that our colleague has made about the conservation of the labor force, that, I mean, it was about economic exploitation and the use of the very skilled indigenous people on the basis of their knowledge about the fur seals and other marine mammals was essential. On the United States side, you had the terminology of uncivilized tribes and the attachment of these terms like barbarians and savages but we have to remember as well that in the background you had the Supreme Court of the United States grappling with how to legitimize their hold over indigenous peoples, and the whole experience, and we saw it kind of visually with the maps of manifest destiny and grabbing more and more territory as they went. But nevertheless, the way that I read the Treaty of Cession is that there was and really maybe accidentally the Aboriginal right and title that remained intact, and that even the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is evidence that the United States government was treating Alaska Native people like all other Indian people throughout the United States. And that does beg the question about the right of self-government, the right of self-determination, and ensuring our right to harvesting and so forth. I did have a question to my Russian colleagues, and that is about, is it the case that Veniaminov in particular did advocate for the protection of Alaska Native people in akin to what you're describing about family and love and the intermarriages that took place? Did he actually communicate with the capital about the treatment of the Inungan people, the Aleut people, the Alutiiq people?
So, well, I think Veniaminov, or Innocent, as he was later known, Bishop Innocent, he was a remarkable man for many reasons, right? But he did have a very interesting way of. I mean, he wrote a long book about the Aleuts and the Tlingit, and I think ultimately he did think that they would be Russianized, that they would become more and more like the rest of the right. And he was not unique in that belief. That was just a very common 19th century belief. But he also wanted to preserve their language, and he wrote, translated. And so I think he had he called, for example, the Aleuts ideal Christians. So he had a very, I would say, for the times, right, in the 19th century, I think he had a very tolerant view and very accepting view of of natives.
We should not forget, though, as well, Nikolai Rozanov, when he was in the colony in 1803, 1804, took testimony in various places, including from the monk German on Spruce Island off Kodiak, and reported back to St. Petersburg, to the board and to the Tsar, on the condition of Alaska Native people, yes? And in the Orthodox Church, when he was canonized in 1977, he was given the accolade of Defender of Alaska's Native People.
I would like to. Andrei Grinev would be probably the best person to talk about Father Herman. Рязанов and Father Herman.
Что касается Рязанова и отца Германа, то там отношения были, так сказать, опять же, не такие простые.
Relationships between Рязанов and Father Herman were complicated.
Дело в том, что в это время миссия, которая была на Кодиаке с 1794 года,
Russian Orthodox mission on Kodiak,
которая была с 1700.
Russian Orthodox mission on Kodiak that started in 1794.
Она находилась в глубоком кризисе.
Saw the crisis.
И Рязанов критиковал миссионеров за то, что они плохо справляются своими обязанностями.
Рязанов criticized Russian missions that they didn't fulfill their duties properly.
И в частности, они не знали ни кодиакского, эскимосского, ни алютского языка.
These missionaries on Kodiak didn't speak Alutiiq.
Ну вот как и английский.
Like he said, he's joking. He said, their level of Alutiiq was like my English.
Так вот, он поставил во главе миссии иеромонаха Гедеона, который с ним прибыл в Русскую Америку.
Рязанов put as a head of this mission here monk Gideon.
И запретил монахам
And forbade the monks
вмешиваться в дела российско-американской компании, в том числе и писать в Петербург.
And forbade monks to interfere in the life of Russian-American company, and he strictly forbade monks to write directly to St. Petersburg to complain.
Поэтому тут не совсем вопрос поставлен корректно. Рязанов считал, что миссия должна обслуживать прежде всего интересы компании.
Рязанов believed that the Russian Orthodox mission had to serve the interest of the Russian-American company. First of all,
интересы государства и компании были на первом месте.
Rязанов believed that the interest of the Russian Empire and the interest of the Russian-American company were the priorities, the major priorities.
А интересы туземцев, интересы местного населения, конечно, были вторичны.
The interests of the local population were the secondary matter for Rязанов.
Каких-то особых отношений с монахом Германом у него не было, насколько я знаю.
Rязанов didn't have any special relationships with monk Herman.
Он дал инструкцию Гедеону и сам отбыл в Ситку.
He gave guidelines to Gideon and left for Sitka. Rязанов.
Такова история.
That's the history.
Thank you very much. I want to open this to questions from the audience, but first I want to ask if any of our native presenters have a comment.
So one of the things about just one tiny comment about Russia, you know, if you go to Southeast and you talk to people who are Russian Orthodox, they'll talk about how, you know, you mentioned that the Russian Orthodox Church was indigenized, and that comes out of the Russian historical tradition, which is that the Russians couldn't overtake every ethnic group that they encountered. And so they did have to kind of accommodate those local cultures. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is intergenerational trauma. I had dinner last night with Bob Sam from Sitka, and he's involved in a project to bring back 16, the remains of 16 children who died at Carlisle Institute in Pennsylvania. And I said, well, you know, are there families involved in deciding where those remains will be interred? And he said, in many cases, their family is extinct. And I'm so used to natives having, you know, huge families. I said, are you sure? And he said, whole villages were wiped out by disease. And non-natives would come into a village and they might find a child still alive and just hanging on for dear life, and no adults capable of taking care of the child. So that was just, so you know, I've talked to people who said that happened to their family, and you think of these terrible losses that happened, and another aspect to that, intergenerational trauma, was the, and you'll still hear this today, people my age will talk about how they were hit on the hands with a ruler, or they had their mouth washed out with soap if they spoke the only language they knew, which was their native language. And so you think, and I see this in my own family. My mother went to a boarding school, and you know, she's very different. She was very different from her sisters who didn't. And it shaped her character, and it made her a very different person.
Well, I would like to ask if we have questions from the audience, and I may need a little bit of help, Peter, because it's difficult to see from up here because we have bright lights in our eyes. So, do we have questions from the audience for any of our presenters, or any comments that you would like to make? Right here.
Were the Russians aware that there were significant mineral deposits in Alaska, and if so, why were they so uninterested in exploiting them or exploring them?
The question was about were, as I understood, were the mineral resources developed by the Russian-American company or not, correct? Did they know about the mineral resources or not?
Why would they sell it?
Нет, были открыты. Значит, что касается минеральных ресурсов, то русские прекрасно знали о довольно больших запасах угля каменного, и они разрабатывали его на полуострове Кинай. Кроме того, русские
Russians actually knew about the coal deposits in the Kenai area, and they did develop them.
Русские знали о запасах меди, самородной на Медной реке, на реке Купер.
Russians knew about the deposits, copper deposits on the Copper River.
Но разработка не велась, потому что очень отдаленное было место и коммуникаций не было никаких.
But the lack of communications prevented the development of these deposits, copper deposits.
Русские пытались искать золото, в частности здесь же на Кинайском полуострове.
They tried to look for gold here in the Cook Inlet area.
Было очень незначительное, найдено очень немножко золота, совсем не стоило разработки.
But they didn't find any significant deposits. It was not commercial.
Русские знали и даже о том, что на Аляске есть нефть.
They even knew about the oil on Alaska.
Вот. Но дело в том, что Российско-американская компания, которая управляла Русской Америкой от лица государства, она заинтересована была прежде всего в пушной добыче пушнины и торговле.
But the problem here was the Russian-American company itself that was interested most of all in developing the fur resources, not the other resources.
Она не хотела отвлекать свои средства, людей, ресурсы на, так сказать, побочные отрасли.
The Russian-American company did not want to divert its resources to do other things.
Дело в том, что государство давало монопольные права российско-американской компании на 20 лет, и не было уверенности, что дальше будут они продлены, поэтому разрабатывать, вкладывать большие капиталы и надолго не было смысла.
The empire gave monopoly rights to the Russian-American company for 20 years. And each 20 years, the empire extended this monopoly, and the Russian-American company wasn't sure how long this monopoly would continue, so they wanted to develop the fur resources as much as possible.
Единственное вот исключение это была добыча угля, но неудачный опыт был.
The only exception is developing coal in the Kenai area, but again, it was so minuscule that we don't need even to talk about it.
И последнее, боялись, что
And the last point,
если будут открыты запасы золота в Русской Америке крупные, то либо государство заберет, так сказать, на себя, отнимет просто колонию российско-американской компании, либо будет наплыв американских старателей, британских старателей, и эта территория опять уйдет от России.
and there was a big fear on the part of the Russian-American company. If the gold would be discovered and developed, that either the Russian state would take these resources over, or American gold miners would come and take it over.
Do we have other questions?
Up here. Would you speak about the reaction within Russia on the sale of Russian America to the United States and any kind of, how can I say, anti-czarist feeling that it might have created?
The question is, could you address what was the reaction in Russia to the sale of Russian America, and in particular, did it generate any backlash, any particular feeling against people who were responsible for the sale?
Good question, but again, Andrei Grinev will be the best person to answer this question. So go ahead.
Реакция в России на продажу Аляски. Протестовали ли?
Нет. Да, была негативная реакция.
There was some negative reaction.
Да, но этой реакции не давали проявиться в полную силу, потому что поскольку продало правительство, оно не подлежало критике. Царь продал.
But the government didn't allow this negative reaction to manifest itself openly and widely, because it was the state that made decision, and the state was beyond the criticism. The state was the czar.
В России государство это святое.
In Russia, the state is sacred. Was and is sacred.
Была негативная реакция была, но очень такая скрытая, как бы неявная.
There was a hidden negative reaction, not clearly expressed in the press.
Thank you.
I have a question, Steve.
Yes, Peter?
What's the contemporary reaction to the sale of Alaska?
I will be the best person to answer this question.
Is it okay?
Yes, please.
I researched this issue. I've been researching this issue for the past 10 years, actually. And I will say in a few words that in current Russia, rhetoric about the sale of Alaska occupies an important place in the minds of so-called Russian patriots or nationalists who use Russian presence in Alaska to instigate the nationalistic sentiments in Russia. And the major reason why Alaska is exploited by Russian nationalists is because Alaska was sold to the United States. So I link this interest among Russian nationalists and this lamentation about our Alaska, this lost Alaska that we need to go to get back Alaska. I link it to the present day, the popularity of anti-American sentiments in present day Russia. And briefly, again, the last point, Russian nationalists believe that Alaska was not sold to the United States, some of them, that it was rented, it was ceded unfairly, that it's ours, quote unquote. Those Russian nationalists who know about this treaty, about the sale, quote unquote, between the treaty between the two powers, Russia Empire and the United States, they blame Alexander II, the Tsar, liberal Tsar, as they emphasize, in betraying the interests of Russia. Okay.
Thank you. Did I see a question behind? Yes.
Yes. For the gentleman on the far left, how did the Russian Orthodox Church, I wanted to know if it respected shamanism and spirituality of the indigenous people, and how did that compare to Western ministries when they arrived from America?
Okay, I think you're probably the best for that, to answer that one, shamanism. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention a little bit something related. Yeah, I'll let Andrei handle the shamanism part because he knows much more about it. But I wanted to say one thing that was very surprising about the sale is Alaska to the United States is that Vinkovetsky, the Russian, he was actually for the sale. He approved of the sale, and that many people don't know that. And the reason for that is because he was glad to move the diocese of the Orthodox Church from Sitka, where it was a small place, to San Francisco, and to be able to found what is today the Orthodox Church in America all over the United States and move the headquarters first to San Francisco and then later to New York. And so to him, this was, he saw it, at that point he was the Archbishop of Moscow, but he looked at this with great approval. But I'll let now Andrei speak about, he wrote a book about Christianity and shamanism, so.
Briefly, in answering your question, is the attitudes of the Russian Orthodox Church to shamanism were, of course, negative. But it doesn't mean that shamanism did not prosper under the Russian Orthodox Church. The problem here is that we have to see the difference between Greek Orthodox Church on the one hand and the so-called Protestant ministry. And the Protestant missionaries who worked among indigenous populations of North America, they tried to impose frequently strict requirements. They wanted this allegiance to the book, to the Bible. So there were strict requirements. As far as the Russian Orthodox Church, it did not impose on its flock strict requirements. So everybody was admitted because potentially they could be Christianized. So under the guise of this superficial Christianization, we have continuation of shamanism. So in local villages, I wrote about Cook Inlet area, Tabascan people. In local areas, shamanism prospered, and frequently the same people who were shamans, they acted as local deacons, as lay readers, and they successfully merged two things, shamanism and Christianity, and we have this mixture, syncretism. Okay, and I don't think there was a contradiction. They simply added Russian Christianity and included it into their own spiritual life, and it became indigenous Christianity.
Thank you. The final comment, David? Sure. Or is there another question?
What I wanted to say in relation to the question about whether or not there was opposition to the sale of Russian America is that on an indigenous perspective, and actually your opening remarks somewhat confirm the validity of a particular indigenous perspective, and that is that, okay, the Russians didn't actually own our territory, our homelands, and our Aboriginal right and title remains intact, and therefore Alaska should be re-enlisted in the non-self-governing territory chapter of the United Nations Charter and be decolonized, and that we should now move forward with a full claim on the basis of Aboriginal right and title to the whole of the territory of Alaska. And technically speaking and legally speaking, when you look at the text of the treaty and all the subsequent activities, including federal Indian law doctrine, statutory law, all the different case law, up until ANCSA, Aboriginal title was intact. So that the claim isn't that ridiculous. It's actually a pretty valid claim with legal standing. And it's interesting that indigenous peoples who've been engaged at the United Nations have done extraordinary outreach to all the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs people that they can get their hands on about this argument. So that's just been kind of an interesting development that is responsive to the right of self-determination, the rights to hunting and fishing, greater claims beyond the 44 million acres of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and so forth. But I just think it's an interesting footnote, especially in the context of the reactions from the Capitol.
The hour grows late. We could take just one more question, please.
Thank you. I really appreciate hearing your perspective on this. I just recently read an article about the Hudson Bay Company paying the indigenous people in Canada where they wanted hunting rights, and they pay them like a rental fee per year, which was something like, I don't know, $3 or $4 a year, and it's never gone up since, the 1850s, and so they're looking at that again. And I think what you said, Daley, about the, Aboriginal hunting rights never, ever being recognized by the Russians, the fact that the Hudson Bay Company did recognize the indigenous people's hunting rights at that time. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and why that didn't happen here.
Actually, I think that our Russian colleagues might be much more in a position to respond to the question. Just quickly on the experience, and I'm glad that somebody mentioned the Canadian Confederation and the fact that they're experiencing a sesquicentennial of their own. But not surprisingly, Indigenous peoples in Canada have very much the same reaction as Indigenous peoples in Alaska and the 150th anniversary of the Treaty of Cession. In fact, if I had used a PowerPoint, the opening quote was from a Coast Salish woman talking about Canada 150. So it's just really interesting as far as North America is concerned. Significantly, hunting and fishing rights for especially the Inuit throughout the Canadian Arctic have been affirmed in every single one of the comprehensive land claims agreements that are modern day treaties that receive constitutional protection in Canada. And maybe some of what you've asked in your question about the Hudson's Bay Company are the historical antecedents to this, but I think it is quite remarkable that they looked at what happened here in Alaska and the purported extinguishment of Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights and went completely the opposite direction and have entrenched Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights in every single one of their comprehensive land claims agreements, including authority and jurisdiction and right to manage and co-manage all of the resources that they depend upon as far as harvesting rights are concerned.
Wow, embarrassment of riches. There was a quote at the beginning of the trailer video that you saw at the beginning that we want history to be simple, and it's not. It's always more complicated than we would like it to be or give it credit for. And perhaps this panel helps us to understand that. Perhaps some new perspectives this sesquicentennial gives us on the complicated nature of the Russian-American experience in North America, the small number of people and the motivation for what was going on here and the interaction with the native people. And perhaps the sesquicentennial will, certainly as I hope and I know others do, help to sensitize us to the issue of indigenous rights and to the emotional burden that many, many Alaska Native people carry yet today. I would ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for the insights that they provided with us and for being here with us tonight. Thank you.